Emily Thompson seemed like the perfect daughter. At 24, she had a bright future ahead of her, with a good job, a loving family, and a smile that could light up any room. But behind closed doors, Emily had a dark secret. She was trapped in the grip of a drug addiction that controlled her every move. Her father, John, never suspected a thing. He trusted her completely, believing she was the same sweet girl he had raised. But one cold December night, everything changed. John discovered something that shattered his heart, a hidden stash of drugs in Emily's room. Shocked and hurt, he confronted her, trying to understand how his little girl had fallen so far. But the confrontation quickly turned deadly. Emily, desperate and scared, did something unthinkable. In a moment of panic, Emily struck her father, killing him instantly. The house, once filled with love and laughter, was now a crime scene, and Emily's perfect world came crashing down. What drove Emily to such a horrific act? Emily Thompson was a young woman who seemed to have everything going for her. She was 24 years old, with a good job, a close-knit group of friends, and a family who loved her dearly. Emily had grown up in a small town where everyone knew each other. Her father, John Thompson, was a well-respected bank manager, and her mother, Linda, was a school teacher. Together, they provided Emily with a stable and loving home. From the outside, Emily appeared to be living the perfect life. She was the kind of daughter every parent dreamed of: polite, responsible, and successful. But beneath the surface, Emily was hiding a dark secret. During her last year of university, Emily had started using drugs. It began innocently enough. She was under a lot of pressure, trying to balance her studies, a part-time job, and her social life. One night, a friend offered her something to help her relax, to take the edge off. Emily, feeling overwhelmed and stressed, accepted. The drug made her feel calm, relaxed, like everything was going to be okay. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, and she craved it. What started as occasional use quickly spiraled into something more. Emily began to rely on the drugs to get through her days. Whenever she felt stressed or anxious, she turned to them. They became her escape from the pressures of her life, a way to numb the pain she felt inside. But as her dependency grew, so did her need to keep it hidden. Emily knew that if anyone found out, it would ruin her image as the perfect daughter. She couldn't bear the thought of disappointing her parents, especially her father, who had always been her biggest supporter. So Emily became very good at hiding her addiction. She continued to go to work, to spend time with her friends, and to act like everything was fine. She made sure to always be on her best behavior when she was around her family. She kept her grades up, got a good job after graduation, and did everything she could to maintain the illusion that she had it all together. But inside, Emily was falling apart. The drugs had taken over her life, and she was losing control. As time went on, Emily began to withdraw from her loved ones. She stopped spending time with her friends and made excuses to avoid family gatherings. She didn't want anyone to see how much she had changed. She knew that if they looked closely, they would see the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands shook, the way she was always tired and on edge. But no matter how hard she tried to hide it, the signs of her addiction were becoming harder to conceal. John Thompson, Emily's father, was the first to notice that something was wrong. He had always been close to his daughter, and he could tell that she wasn't herself. Emily was quieter than usual, often looking tired and distracted. She seemed distant, like her mind was somewhere else. John tried to talk to her, to find out what was bothering her, but Emily always brushed him off. She told him she was just tired from work, that everything was fine. John wanted to believe her, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. As Emily's addiction worsened, it began to affect her work. She started missing days, calling in sick when she was too strung out to function. Her once impeccable appearance began to slip. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair was unkempt, and she often looked disheveled. Her boss noticed and warned her that if she didn't improve, she could lose her job. Emily was terrified of losing her job, but she couldn't stop using the drugs. They had become the only thing that made her feel normal, even if just for a little while. One night after a particularly bad day, Emily came home late. She had been out using, and she was high, her mind foggy, and her body exhausted. She hoped to avoid her parents and go straight to her room, but John was waiting for her. He had been worried about her all day and decided to check on her room while she was out. That's when he found the hidden stash of drugs under her bed. John was shocked and heartbroken. This was his little girl, the one he had always protected and loved. How had she fallen into this? When Emily walked into her room and saw her father holding the bag of drugs, she froze. Her heart raced as she realized that her secret was out. John looked at her with a mix of anger and sadness, demanding to know how long this had been going on. Emily tried to lie, to say that it wasn't hers, but John wasn't buying it. He was hurt, deeply hurt, that his daughter had kept such a terrible secret from him. John told Emily that they needed to talk, that she needed help. But Emily, in her drug-addled state, couldn't handle it. She was overwhelmed with fear, guilt, and shame. She knew her life was about to come crashing down, and she couldn't face it. She felt cornered, like there was no way out. As John continued to press Emily for answers, she became increasingly agitated. Her mind was spinning, trying to come up with an excuse or a way out of the situation, but the drugs had dulled her ability to think clearly. All she could feel was a rising panic, a fear that she had never experienced before. She had never seen her father so angry, so disappointed. The thought of losing his love and respect was more than she could bear. John tried to remain calm, but he was struggling. He couldn't believe what he had found in his daughter's room. The idea that she had been hiding such a dangerous secret from him was too much to take in. He wanted to help her, to make things right, but he didn't know how. He started talking about rehab, about getting her professional help. But Emily wasn't listening. All she could think about was how her world was falling apart. The argument escalated quickly. Emily was defensive, lashing out at her father, blaming him for putting too much pressure on her. She accused him of never understanding her, of always expecting too much. John was taken aback by her words. He had always tried to be a good father, to support her in everything she did, but now it seemed like everything he had done had pushed her away. Emily's anger and fear turned into something darker. She felt trapped, like there was no escape from the situation. The thought of going to rehab, of admitting her addiction to everyone, was too much. She couldn't bear the shame. In that moment, something inside her snapped. As the argument reached its peak, Emily did something she would never have thought herself capable of. In a moment of blind panic and rage, she grabbed a heavy object from her bedside table, a small lamp, and struck her father with it. The blow was unexpected and powerful, knocking John to the floor. He hit his head hard on the edge of the bed as he fell, and there was a sickening crack. The room fell silent. Emily stood frozen, the lamp still in her hand, as she looked down at her father. He wasn't moving. Blood was pooling around his head, staining the carpet. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had killed her father. For a moment she couldn't move. Her mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. She wanted to believe that this was just a nightmare, that she would wake up and everything would be fine. But this was real. John was dead, and she was the one who had killed him. The house, once filled with warmth and love, was now cold and silent. Emily felt like she was in a daze, unable to comprehend the enormity of what she had done. Her father, the man who had always been there for her, who had loved her unconditionally, was gone. And it was her fault. As Emily stood over her father's body, the shock of what she had done left her numb. She couldn't believe that she had killed the one person who had always been there for her, who had loved her more than anyone else in the world. But there was no undoing what had happened. Her father was gone and she was alone. Panic set in as Emily realized the gravity of her situation. She had to do something, but she didn't know what. She couldn't call the police; they would arrest her for murder. She couldn't tell anyone, because then everyone would know what she had done. She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. In her panic, Emily decided to try to cover up the crime. She couldn't think clearly, but she knew she had to get rid of the evidence. She grabbed a towel and started wiping up the blood, trying to erase any trace of what had happened. But the blood kept spreading, seeping into the carpet and staining her hands. It was no use; she couldn't clean up the mess she had made. Desperate, Emily thought about running away. She could leave town, start over somewhere new where no one knew her. But then she realized that she would have to leave everything behind: her home, her friends, her job. And even then, she couldn't escape what she had done. The guilt would follow her wherever she went. As the hours passed, Emily's panic gave way to despair. She sat on the floor next to her father's body, unable to move or think. She couldn't bring herself to look at him, but she couldn't look away either. The reality of what she had done weighed on her like a heavy blanket, suffocating her with guilt and fear. Emily felt completely lost, with no idea of what to do next. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity as she sat there, frozen by the enormity of her actions. Eventually, the sound of the front door opening brought her back to reality. Emily's mother, Linda, had returned home from work. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she heard her mother calling out for her and John. She knew there was no way to hide what had happened, The moment Linda walked into the room and saw the scene before her, she screamed. The sound was sharp, filled with horror and disbelief, echoing through the house. Linda rushed to John's side, trying to shake him awake, but it was clear he was gone. Her shock quickly turned to grief as she realized what had happened. Tears streamed down her face as she cradled her husband's lifeless body, unable to comprehend the sudden and violent loss. Emily watched her mother fall apart, but she couldn't bring herself to say anything. She was too consumed by her own guilt and fear. Linda's cries drew the attention of the neighbors, who quickly called the police. Within minutes, the house was surrounded by flashing lights and the sound of sirens. Emily remained in a daze as officers arrived and began assessing the scene. They quickly took in the situation: the blood on the carpet, the lamp lying on the floor, and Emily's shocked, vacant expression. One of the officers gently led Linda away from John's body, trying to console her as best as he could. Another officer approached Emily, asking her what had happened. But Emily couldn't find the words to explain. She was too overwhelmed, too lost in the nightmare she had created. The officer noticed the blood on her hands and clothes and realized that she was likely the one responsible for the crime. Emily was placed under arrest and led out of the house in handcuffs. She didn't resist, she didn't even seem to register what was happening. All she could think about was the fact that her father was dead, and she was the one who had killed him. As she was placed in the back of a police car, Emily looked back at the house that had been her home, now a crime scene. She knew that her life, as she knew it, was over. The investigation into John Thompson's death was not just swift, it was meticulous, leaving no stone unturned. The police arrived at the Thompson household within minutes of Linda's frantic call. The scene that greeted them was one of both tragedy and confusion. A once serene home had been transformed into a crime scene, with John's lifeless body lying on the bedroom floor, and Emily, the once perfect daughter, sitting nearby in a state of shock. The first responders carefully secured the scene, making sure that nothing was disturbed. Forensic experts were called in to gather evidence, and they worked diligently, documenting every detail. The lamp, which had been used as the murder weapon, was carefully bagged as evidence. It was clear that the force of the blow had been significant, and the blood spatter on the walls and carpet told a grim story. The room, which had once been Emily's sanctuary, now bore the marks of a violent outburst that had ended in death. Emily was immediately taken into custody. The police were careful with her, understanding that she was in a fragile state of mind, but they also knew that they had to proceed with the investigation. Emily was escorted to the police station, where she was placed in a holding cell, still in shock, her clothes stained with her father's blood. Back at the Thompson house, the forensic team continued their work late into the night. They dusted for fingerprints, collected samples, and took photographs of the crime scene from every angle. The blood on the carpet and walls was carefully analyzed, and it became clear that the fatal blow had been delivered with a single, powerful strike. The fact that John had hit his head on the edge of the bed as he fell only added to the tragedy, as it was likely this impact that had ultimately killed him. The police also began their interviews with those who knew the family. They spoke to Linda first, who was still reeling from the shock of losing her husband and seeing her daughter arrested for his murder. Linda struggled to make sense of what had happened. She explained that Emily had always been a good daughter, never causing any trouble, always striving to make her parents proud. She mentioned that she had noticed Emily seemed distant lately, more withdrawn, but she had never imagined it was because of something so serious. The police then turned their attention to Emily's friends and co-workers. They wanted to understand who Emily was, what might have led her to commit such a violent act. Her friends were stunned when they heard the news. They described Emily as someone who was always put together, responsible, and kind. She had never shown any signs of being capable of violence. But as the police dug deeper, they began to hear whispers of something darker, a secret that Emily had been hiding from everyone. It was during these interviews that the police first heard about Emily's drug use. A close friend of Emily's mentioned that she had suspected something was wrong when Emily started pulling away from their group. She had noticed that Emily seemed more anxious, more tired, but when she tried to ask Emily about it, Emily always brushed her off. The friend admitted that she had seen Emily hanging out with a different crowd at the university, people known for their party lifestyle, and she had worried that Emily might be getting involved in something she couldn't handle. This information was a turning point in the investigation. The police now had a motive, a possible explanation for why Emily, the seemingly perfect daughter, had snapped and killed her father. They obtained a warrant to search Emily's room more thoroughly, and it didn't take long for them to find more evidence of her drug use. Hidden in various places around her room were small bags of pills, a few syringes, and other drug paraphernalia. It was clear that Emily's addiction had been going on for some time, and that it had played a significant role in the tragic events that had unfolded. With this new information, the police were able to build a strong case against Emily. They pieced together the events of that night, how John had confronted Emily about the drugs, how Emily had become increasingly agitated, and how, in a moment of fear and desperation, she had lashed out violently. The evidence was overwhelming, and it painted a clear picture of what had happened. The news of the murder and Emily's arrest spread quickly through the small town. It was the kind of story that people couldn't stop talking about. The Thompsons were well known in the community, and everyone had always seen them as the perfect family. The idea that Emily, the sweet, responsible daughter, could kill her own father was unimaginable. But the evidence was undeniable, and the town was left to grapple with the shocking reality. When the case went to trial, the courtroom was packed every day. People were curious to see what would happen, to hear the details of the crime, and to try to understand how something so terrible could have happened. The media coverage was intense, with reporters from local and national outlets covering every twist and turn of the trial. Emily's defense team had a difficult job. They knew that the evidence against Emily was strong, and they didn't try to deny that she had killed her father. Instead, they focused on explaining why it had happened. They presented evidence of Emily's drug addiction, detailing how it had started and how it had taken over her life. They called expert witnesses who testified about the effects of long-term drug use on a person's behavior and decision-making abilities. They argued that Emily had been under immense pressure to maintain her perfect image, and that this pressure, combined with her addiction, had led her to a breaking point. The defense also brought up Emily's mental state at the time of the crime. They argued that she had been in a state of panic and fear, not fully aware of what she was doing. They presented evidence that Emily had been suffering from severe anxiety and depression, conditions that had been exacerbated by her drug use. They claimed that Emily had not intended to kill her father, but had acted out of a desperate need to protect herself from the consequences of her addiction being exposed. The prosecution, however, was relentless in their pursuit of justice for John Thompson. They painted a picture of Emily as someone who had made a series of bad choices, leading to a tragic outcome. They argued that, while Emily may have been struggling with addiction, it did not excuse her actions. They pointed to the fact that Emily had tried to cover up the crime, wiping away blood and attempting to hide the evidence, as proof that she knew what she had done was wrong. They argued that Emily had shown a complete disregard for her father's life, and that she should be held fully accountable for her actions. The trial lasted for several weeks, with both sides presenting their arguments in detail. The jury listened carefully, weighing the evidence and testimony. Emily remained quiet and withdrawn throughout the proceedings. She rarely looked up from her seat, her eyes focused on the floor in front of her. She didn't argue with the charges against her, she didn't try to explain or justify what she had done. It was clear that she was deeply remorseful, but also resigned to whatever fate awaited her. When the jury finally reached a verdict, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Emily was found guilty of manslaughter, a lesser charge than murder, but still a serious crime. The judge, taking into account Emily's age, her lack of a criminal record, and her apparent remorse, sentenced her to a lengthy prison term. The sentence was meant to reflect both the severity of the crime and the hope that, in time, Emily might be able to rebuild her life. Emily's journey into the penal system began with a profound sense of isolation. As she was escorted from the courtroom to a correctional facility, the reality of her situation fully hit her. She was no longer the vibrant young woman with a promising future, she was now a convicted felon, sentenced to years behind bars. The transition from her comfortable home to the harsh environment of prison was jarring. The once familiar surroundings of her life were replaced by cold, gray walls, the clang of metal doors, and the constant hum of activity from other inmates. The prison routine was strict and unyielding. Days began early with a loud wake-up call, followed by roll call, meals, work assignments, and limited recreational time. Every minute of Emily's day was accounted for, and the monotony was suffocating. In the beginning, she struggled to adjust to her new reality. The rigid schedule, the lack of privacy, and the constant presence of guards and other inmates made her feel like she was living in a nightmare. Emily found herself isolated, both physically and emotionally. The other inmates knew her story, how the perfect daughter had killed her father, and many kept their distance. Those who did approach her often did so out of curiosity or a desire to hear more about her crime, which only deepened her sense of alienation. She spent most of her time alone, lost in her thoughts, replaying the events of that fateful night over and over in her mind. The guilt weighed heavily on her. She had taken the life of the man who had loved her unconditionally, who had provided for her, and who had only wanted to help her. No matter how much time passed, Emily couldn't escape the memories of what she had done. They haunted her every waking moment, and even in her dreams she couldn't find peace. The isolation only intensified her feelings of remorse and regret. Meanwhile, life outside the prison walls continued, though it was forever changed by the events that had transpired. Linda Thompson, now a widow, was left to navigate the world without her husband and with the knowledge that her daughter was responsible for his death. The grief was overwhelming, and Linda found it difficult to move on. The home they had shared, once filled with warmth and laughter, became a place of sorrow and loneliness. Every room held memories of John, and the silence that filled the house was a constant reminder of what had been lost. Linda struggled to find a way forward. She sought solace in her community, but even there, she felt the weight of judgment. While some people were sympathetic, understanding that Linda had suffered a tremendous loss, others were not as forgiving. Whispers and gossip followed her wherever she went, and she could sense the pity in people's eyes. It was as if she had become a living reminder of the tragedy that had struck the town, and people didn't know how to approach her. The town itself was also affected by the crime. The Thompson family had been well respected, and John's death sent shockwaves through the community. People who had once admired and looked up to the Thompsons were now left questioning how something so terrible could have happened. The story of Emily's crime became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily a seemingly perfect life could fall apart. The community's sense of security and trust was shattered, and it took a long time for the town to recover from the scandal. As the years passed, Emily's story became a part of the town's history, a dark chapter that people spoke of in hushed tones. For many, it was a reminder of the dangers of hidden struggles, of the pressures to maintain a perfect image, and of the devastating consequences that could arise when those pressures became too much to bear. Emily herself remained in prison, serving out her sentence. She had plenty of time to reflect on her actions, to think about the choices she had made and the consequences they had brought. In prison, Emily tried to find a way to atone for what she had done. She participated in rehabilitation programs, attended counseling sessions, and worked hard to stay out of trouble. But no matter what she did, she knew that she could never truly make up for taking her father's life. The guilt and regret would be with her forever, a burden she would carry for the rest of her life. However, there was also a glimmer of hope. Emily knew that one day she would be released from prison. She would have a chance to start over, to rebuild her life. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't erase the past, but it was the only way forward. She hoped that, in time, she might find a way to make amends for the pain she had caused, even if it was in small ways. She dreamed of a future where she could help others who were struggling, where she could use her own experiences to prevent others from making the same mistakes she had. But those dreams were still far off. For now, Emily's reality was the cold, hard walls of the prison. Every day was a reminder of what she had lost: her freedom, her family, her future. She had nothing but time to think about the life she could have had if she had made different choices. She knew that she would never be the person she was before, but she hoped that one day she might find a way to live with the person she had become. The story of Emily Thompson is a tragic one, a reminder of how quickly life can change and how the choices we make can have far-reaching consequences. It's a story of loss, of regret, and of the struggle to find redemption in the face of unimaginable pain. For those who knew Emily and John, it is a story that will never be forgotten, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most seemingly perfect lives. The impact of that tragic night will be felt for years to come by Emily, by Linda, and by the entire community that was forever changed by the crime.